Welcome to ORF America, where it's my privilege to host you for a discussion on advancing the development agenda in the Global South, along with the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar, and I'm Executive Director here. For those of you new to our organization, ORF America is a small and still relatively new public policy think tank here in Washington, affiliated with the Observer Research Foundation in India, and focused on US-India relations in a global context. Some of the issues we've centered our efforts on in recent years include defense industrial cooperation, emerging technologies such as semiconductors and AI, clean and green energy supply chains, and international financial institutional reform. We meet here at a crucial time. The entire global development agenda, one that took shape after World War II and accelerated in the 1990s and after, is today very much in question. And this isn't simply an academic problem, because those facing the brunt of this challenge are in what some might call the Global South. Just a few years ago, some 2 million people across the developing world perished in a pandemic, one that did not originate in their country, and whose severity was exacerbated by a lack of planning, insufficient medical and protective equipment, and delayed vaccine rollouts. It may be inconvenient now to remind people of this, but through acts of commission and omission, there are actors in certain industrialized economies who bear culpability for this. And sadly, these problems of inequity persist. As we face inflation here, as I'm reminded every week when I go to buy groceries, it's worth remembering that for every 1% rise in global food prices, 10 million people are pushed into poverty, overwhelmingly in the Global South. Even now, some 150 million people suffering from 150 million more people are suffering from malnutrition compared to before the pandemic. And today, millions of people suffering from HIV are losing access to life-saving drugs. I think what's frustrating about a lot of this is that many of these problems, and these are matters of life and death, are political in nature. A US government, one elected with a very strong mandate by the American people and accountable to US taxpayers, has every right to choose how to deploy its resources. But recent events are underscoring how development assistance is by no means guaranteed, and the notions of justice and equity and rights are not going to cut it. The questions the Global South will have to ask now is how to leverage their advantages, natural resources, their markets, their geography. For we are in an era of tough bargaining. How can they find solutions in each other? What are venues for South-South cooperation? And what are the broad contours of a common agenda? The topics we have chosen for today, institutional reform and debt sustainability, food and health security, and financing the climate transition, are one attempt at identifying some of the areas that matter as much to an India as they do to an Ivory Coast, a Vietnam and a Venezuela, a Tonga and a Togo, a Brazil and a Bhutan. It's also important, I think, to highlight that there is no single Global South perspective, and that no country or individual can claim one. These are diverse regions home to 5.5 billion people from around 130 countries. But as the only developing country-affiliated think tank in Washington, D.C., we at ORF America can work in our small way to amplify some of these perspectives, to shape the big decisions that will have very real and very immediate effects on the lives of millions of ordinary people. I should also add that we meet at a particularly somber time for other reasons as well. Our meeting comes one day after a horrific terrorist attack in India, in which at least 26 innocent people were killed. And as I mentioned this morning, it is a tragic reminder that without peace and security, we cannot have the progress and prosperity that all of us seek. With that, I would like to hand it over shortly to Laveesh Bhandari, president of CSEP, which also happens to be my former employer. It's been a real privilege to work with him and his colleagues in organizing this. In fact, this was his brainchild when we met last year. And we'll hear from, amongst others, Montek Singh Ahluwalia on the stage behind me, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, many others. And some of these people I want to emphasize are really the architects, amongst the architects of India's liberalization. And in the years both before and after that were real stewards of India's economy. For many people in India and abroad, and especially I find those of a younger generation, the enormity of what they and their colleagues accomplished is really hard to appreciate today. This included the abolishing of industrial licensing, ceding government authority on the location of industries, eliminating public sector monopolies, lowering investment controls, raising investment caps, and removing import controls. And such steps unleashed an enormous wave of economic activity that has led to hundreds of millions of Indians escaping poverty. These are steps upon which future growth and progress lie, both in India and across the developing world. And it is with this deep sense of appreciation that I now hand it over to Laveesh. Thank you.
Thanks, Dhruva. Good afternoon. It's indeed a great privilege to see such a distinguished gathering interested in the topic of South-South interactions. Let me first start by talking a little bit about CSEP Research Foundation, which is an independent, multidisciplinary policy research institution based in Delhi. We are formerly Brookings Institutions India Center and changed our identity in 2020. CSEP houses 100+ scholars working on diverse areas related to growth, finance and development, energy, natural resources and sustainability, as well as foreign policy and security studies. Within foreign policy issues, we focus on India and its neighborhood, China with a specific focus on climate cooperation, and have a very recently instituted a program focused on India and Africa. Energy transition and sustainability have been a large part of our efforts. This is a long-standing program at CSEP with a strong focus on decarbonization, critical minerals and mining, coal, gas, as well as mobility. In addition, we also have about 10 different verticals working with scholars working on diverse areas, including economic and integrated assessment modeling, macroeconomics and climate finance, health and human development, education skills, community development, government finances, international trade, and digital ecosystem technology and innovation. Partnerships and collaborations have been an integral part of our evolution, and we are building active research engagement programs across Asia, the West, as well as Africa. A large part of our work speaks about and speaks to the developing world, which is now increasingly being referred to as the Global South. There are, of course, at best, limited similarities between these countries, be it on the challenges being faced or the range of potential solutions. Each country is attempting to find its own balance among the growth, equity, sustainability trifecta. There is no doubt that there is much to learn from the experiences of each other. And with the ongoing churn in both geopolitics and geoeconomics, the changing role of Western countries, the emergence of Asia as a major economic center, and a rising Africa, it is evident that how we engage with each other will need to change as well. At the same time, while many experts in the developed world are aware of the challenges being faced by developed countries, there remain many gaps in the understanding of the differing priorities, both at the country level and as a group. And so this initiative on South-South interactions on the sidelines of the World Bank and IMF Spring Meetings in Washington, D.C. Over the next 4 sessions, distinguished experts and thought leaders will share their views on topics related to the development agenda and economic turmoil, advancing the SDGs, food and health security, just and equitable finance, the institutional reform, and debt sustainability, so critical for economic growth and stability. We hope that the insights generated today will set the agenda for a closer South-South collaboration framework. I must say, the Observer Research Foundation has been visionary in building an active presence in the United States. I'm glad that Dhruva, Udebir, Aneth, and the team at ORF America were in sync with us on this collaborative effort. And we are grateful as your host and for your presence. And hopefully this will be the first of many such conferences together. Thank you. May I now request Montek to present his views as a keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laveesh. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. I think Dhruv, when he made his first set of remarks, kind of made the point that there's no such thing as a global south, although there's been a tradition that we kind of take something as a view of the global south, even if no one country can claim to represent that view. And the assumption is that there's the global north, which is doing all right, thank you very much, and it agrees with how the world should be. And then there are all these fellows who are a little bit excluded, who have a different view. Now, of course, this, I think, has become radically different. So I want to use my few minutes to sketch why what we are going to discuss today in the substantive sessions that follow are really pretty standard subjects that we've all dealt with earlier and which have featured in conferences. I mean, institutional reform and debt sustainability. This is a hardy perennial in the discussions on global finance, and I look forward to how we can move forward. SDGs, food, health security, we've had that since, 2015, if not earlier. And of course, there's now increasing climate finance in a manner which is just and fair. That's also been on the agenda. The difference, I think, is that earlier, all these things were being discussed in a context in which more or less people agreed with what kind of a world there should be, and the issue was only one of degree. I mean, less aid, more aid, what do you do, etc. For the first time, we're discussing it in a context where, short of saying that, interaction between countries is itself suspect, that's not the case at the moment, there's a radical change in how this is going to take place. And I just want to mention 4 things that have happened, which are not necessarily completely new, and they put everything in a different perspective. So I think we should keep this in mind when we go through the individual session. Now, what are those things? Now, first of all, clearly, how should world trade be organized? I mean, we're all used to the business, multilateral rules of trade, this, that, and the other. That's been substantially altered in the sense that what we are seeing now is global trade disrupted by unilateral decisions by the largest economy in the whole world, simply saying that trade is not fair and taking a series of actions on tariffs, essentially using that in order to force people to come to the discussion table. Now, you could say that from their point of view, what they're saying is that, look, there are too many obstacles. The earlier system didn't work. We're putting these tariffs in as a threat. And let's say the most positive spin you could put on it is that even if it's violating all the rules, the objectives are to cut down obstacles to trade in every country. And put that way, those arguing that this is what we want would say that if we succeed, we will have actually achieved what all you fellows have been trying to do in multilateral trade negotiations but never got anywhere. But what we don't know is whether that'll happen. I mean, will everybody come down and we'll come to an agreement, or will we have a multiplicity of country-specific tariffs and the negotiations don't necessarily reach a satisfactory conclusion? That's something we've never had since the Second World War. So, I mean, that's a big change, and whenever we discuss these individual subjects, something in the back of one's mind should direct one's attention to the question, is that being satisfactorily resolved or not? I mean, let's hope it is. Second, very important, is really that the role of multilateral institutions in cycling multilateral finance. Now, this, again, has been, for a very long time, an area of consensus. The only difference has been the quantity and the conditionality. With countries on the receiving end saying there should be more and it should be less conditional, or they don't actually say less conditional, they would say more appropriately conditional. The ones on the north say, no, don't want to have too much. It leads to less domestic effort, which is probably true. And anyway, the conditionalities are what prevent misuse of resources. For the first time, I think we are in a position where not the whole North, but the most important northern country has raised some questions about the future of multilateral institutions. Once again, I'm highlighting that it has raised some questions. I believe some sort of a review is underway in the US government on what should be our approach to the multilateral institutions. And you could possibly expect that out of this review will come, let's say, a clearer and possibly well-defined attitude. But certainly, the likelihood is that the prospects of an expansion of flows from these institutions have really receded quite a bit. Certainly in the bilateral sphere, with the closing down of USAID, the signal is that these are not really important things. And I would be surprised if something similar did not happen in the world of multilateral institutions. Now, I say this is relevant because in the entire run-up to the financing of climate change, and that's the third big thing that has happened, well, that has not happened suddenly. That had been happening for quite some time. But you know, until I think about 2 years ago, until Azerbaijan, that is to say COP29, there was a sort of an assumption that the COP process, which is a universal, multilateral universalist process, was bringing about some kind of a global agreement on how much mitigation should different countries undertake. And the world declared victory several times, including us, by the way, at critical points where, for example, in Paris was the first time in 2016 or 15, when the world, all developing countries agreed to undertake some commitment. Now, the only commitment the developing countries agreed to undertake was to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP. That's not a reduction of emissions, because if GDP is rising, you can have a reduction in emissions intensity, well, the emissions still rise. Well, everybody said, wow, that's a breakthrough, first of a time, etc. Very quickly became clear that, you know, this is not going to achieve the stated objective of limiting global warming to less than 2 and preferably 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So a huge diplomatic effort was mounted just before COP26 in 2021 to make everybody agree to something more dramatic. And at that meeting, all countries agreed to bring about an absolute reduction in emissions heading to net zero. Developed countries by mid-century, developing countries a little bit later. I mean, India agreed to go to net zero by 2070. I think I won't mention some of the others a little bit earlier. That was regarded again as a landmark, except that 2 years later, when the UN looked at these things, they came to the conclusion that, first of all, what has been promised is certainly not enough. And secondly, what has been promised is not being done. In other words, what is being acted upon is less than what was promised. But still, you could argue that a kind of annual progression, a sort of a creeping agreement, at least directionally, was taking place. Now, that has totally changed because, as of now, the position of the U.S. establishment, the U.S. administration, is that there is no real need to reduce emissions and that, in effect, the climate change fear is a bogey. The U.S. has withdrawn from its commitments under the Paris Agreement. I don't think they've actually withdrawn from COP. So in the past, this has happened once before, when President Trump, in his first administration, took the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. President Biden brought it right back. And I think on those occasions, the U.S. did go and attend the COP meetings. So while they withdrew from their commitments, which actually, these being voluntary commitments, was not technically a violation of the scheme, though obviously for the largest emitter, the largest country, and the leader of the free world to do that was a bit of a shock. Today, the position is that the U.S. is no longer committed to reduce its own emissions. But what's more is that many European, in the earlier period, NGOs in the United States were very firm that states would push for the emissions reduction commitment, and certainly the Europeans stood firm in their commitments. That is no longer true. It's not very, I think the position of states may vary, but certainly the voice of the NGOs is no longer being heard, at least not as it was then. And I think on the European side, the issue of energy security has kind of taken precedence over the issue of reducing emissions. So on that dimension, I mean, this agreement, which was fragile, appears to have fractured. Linked to that was the issue of climate finance. I mean, everybody agreed that if the developing countries bring about the kind of emissions reduction that was needed to achieve the global targets, they're going to have to spend a lot of money. Apart from that, they needed to spend a lot of money on adjustment, because after all, climate change is happening anyway, and even somewhere between 1.5 and 2, there'd be even more climate change. So the need to spend money on adjustment was there. And I think the global community did signal that we will provide adequate finance, international finance, in a combination of public and private sources. Now, this was an incredible source of disagreement ultimately, because in COP29 in Azerbaijan last year, that was a COP that was tasked with coming up with an international agreement on what's the amount of climate finance that's going to be needed. I mean, earlier, the climate finance agreement was 100 billion per year to be achieved by 2020, but that was calibrated to commitments that were pretty negligible. By the time 2021 happened, it was very clear that to achieve those commitments, the amount of investment countries would have to make would be very substantial. So there was a group set up which reported to COP, and they came up with the conclusion that you need another 2 or 3% of GDP for these countries, to actually more than that, 4% or 5% or so. But then they said that a lot of this would come from internal reorganization. I mean, in the sense that if you need so much for renewable energy and you don't need it for coal, so you'd be saving on coal. But the net increase after taking account of all that, you still needed an additional investment of something of the order of $1.4 trillion by 2035. And then the question is, how is that going to come? And that was said to be coming from a combination of public and private sources, okay? Now, look at the numbers. I mean, the task force that made a recommendation, and I was a member of that task force, sort of said that, you know, about half and half would have to come from the public and public sources, that means bilateral and multilateral, and private sources. Developing countries were not at all happy with this, because they said that, look, in 2022, the total amount of climate finance from the private sector was $22 billion only, and that went to a handful of countries. According to what the task force said, if you made a humongous big effort, this would go up to something like 600 billion by 2035 from the private sector. So from 22 billion to 600 billion. And of course, the logic of that task force, and I was aware that it's a bit of a far cry, but you know, the best mustn't be the enemy of the good kind of thing. We went along. The idea was that if there's a big increase in multilateral funding, that funding could be structured in such a way to do risk reduction for the private sector. Now, that is conceptually possible, but what it means is that organizations like the World Bank, the EBRD, ADB, etc., would have to be considerably funded to expand their lending, and also would have to do things very differently from what they're doing now. But still, you could have argued that there's something happening there. Now, that is, when it went to Azerbaijan, there was absolutely no willingness to agree to 600 billion of public funding. And I think what they came up with was 300 billion. Now, that is before the Trump 2 administration took over. So it's really an open question whether that 300 billion is pie in the sky or not. Now, it is in this is a context in which, you know, I hope we carry on working in this area, because let's face it, without global cooperation, it won't work. But I think we have to recognize that we are all of a sudden afloat on a stormy sea without a raft and a leaky boat hanging around at best. So the question is, what's the strategy? So that's really, when you discuss these things in the session to come, that's what you have to keep in mind. So that's so much on the climate finance issue and climate change issue. I think there are one other thing which is very important, and that is technology. And here, I think it's relatively recent that the emergence of new technology, I have in mind obviously artificial intelligence, but associated things. I mean, it has suddenly created the possibility of a very rapid reduction in the number of jobs of the present kind. And I mean, that's certainly relevant for India, because one of the areas which artificial intelligence might make largely redundant is low-level coding. So what I'm told is that if there are companies, like many of our companies, a lot of our export effort is based on software development. Many of them will actually be able to do without humans doing the coding by bringing in AI. I mean, some of our companies have made public statements to the effect that we don't expect to see a shrinkage in our workforce. But what they're saying is we expect a fourfold increase in revenue, and we don't need to increase the workforce at all. So really, in a sense, what is happening is labor displacement, unless the new technology creates new areas of investment which will generate a demand for new labor. And no doubt, in due course, it might. But there's one difference, and that is that unlike in the past, the pace at which this change is taking place is humongous. I mean, earlier, technologies took about 20 years to spread and diffuse. This thing is, within 2 years, people expect that a lot of this is going to happen. Now, by the way, it's not all negative. I mean, in the sense that the infusion, this was a word that came up in the morning's discussion, infusion of new technology being picked up by existing large companies might well increase their productivity quite a bit. And I'm not an expert on this, but I've talked to a few of our larger companies, and they claim that they are working on it. I mean, everything from logistics to predictive maintenance to preventive maintenance to contract management to dealing with customers through chatbots and what have you, including writing routine letters. They're relying increasingly on sort of AI apps built on existing large language models, but customized for the company. And their assumption is that this will make everything a lot more efficient, which it probably will. But it does mean that they're not going to be needing the kind of people who otherwise were seen to be actually beneficiaries of high-quality jobs. So this raises the question, I mean, how are we going to produce the sorts of jobs that younger people with increasingly good qualifications have come to expect? And clearly, a simple answer would be, well, you just have to grow a lot faster. That's true. I mean, India is growing a little above 6%. I don't know what the trade configuration and mess will do to that growth rate in the next couple of years. I don't think it can possibly increase it. It could be argued that it will reduce it less than it will for other countries, because we are less sort of, in that sense, open, but it can only be a negative. So really, we need to gear ourselves up to whatever, growing at 8%. That's a huge agenda. I mean, if you ask an economist, they'll say, oh, well, that just means you have to aim at a higher total factor productivity growth. But if you ask him, what is total factor productivity growth, they'll say, it's all listed out in Appendix 6, and you'll have about 80 things that are listed. And the fact is, you say that in a public meeting, everybody say, oh, yeah, I'm in favor of higher TFPG. I have never come across any politician who has opposed higher TFPG. They generally say, right on, that's what we need. But if you give them the list of these things, labor, law reform, etc., they'll hang on a minute, that's too complicated. Anyway, that's India. Every country will go through that. So I think this is the context. With the subjects that we're dealing with, maybe I'm practically run out of time. Actually, I've also run out of things to say, so this is a comfortable position to be in. Let me just conclude by saying that I can easily imagine having each of these sessions here 3 years ago. I think to yourself, now that it's not 3 years ago, and now that we know what we know, what is it that you want to say in these sessions that will make the people organizing these sessions respond substantively to how to deal with the new problems that we face? So with those words, thank you, Dhruv and Laveesh, for inviting me, and I look forward to the answers I get in the sessions to follow. Thank you.